This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order some Duskmourn cards, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Sahone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're still talking about Duskmourn Limited, and at this point in the format, I always like to use, my impressions of the format combined with 17 lands data to talk about 10 cards that are being played and taken way more than they should be, certainly being taken higher than they should be based on how they are actually performing. In other words, these cards are being overrated. As usual for this style of video, the data that I'm going to be showing you about where cards are being picked and what their game in hand win rate is comes from 17 lands. You can go to 17lands.com to look at, data for hundreds of thousands of Duskmourn drafts. And you can also sign up to have your data tracked. Obviously, data doesn't tell the whole story. I'm going to talk about that some in this video because there are some of these cards that have as low of win rates as they do, and they're being overrated, but that doesn't mean that they always perform the way the win rate would reflect. This is because there are shortcomings to be had with data, and it's certainly not the end-all, be-all about how good a card is or where you should take it. I would basically never recommend opening up 17 lands and just taking the card with the highest win rate in every pack, because you have to take into account what your deck actually looks like and stuff like that. So keep in mind, I'm not saying that data is the only factor you should consider in Limited, but it is a useful tool to have because most of us can't draft enough, obviously not hundreds of thousands of times, to get out of a small sample size when we're thinking about a limited format. So as usual, I use a baseline card to sort of give us a feel for what's going on in the format. And the baseline card this time around is Winter's Intervention. It's being picked around 7.8, 7.9, and it has a win rate of 55%. That win rate's not as good as it seems because 17 lands users on average have a higher win rate than the whole Magic community does. Obviously, the whole Magic community has a win rate of 50% if you take them all into account. But 17 lands users in Duskmourn Draft have a 54.8% win rate. So Winter's Intervention, it's a nice little removal spell right where you would expect it to be. It's a solid card. This is one of the areas where data's not perfect, though, because sometimes it's hard to tell. Like, we can show you what a win rate is, but it's hard to tell why a win rate is what it is, and that's part of what I do in these videos. But black is kind of a weak color overall, so its collective win rate is lower than the overall win rate. That said, I still think it's worth, having the information about what this card's win rate is and when you can pick it. And every single card on this list has a lower win rate, but is being taken earlier. So whatever it is you think about Winter's Intervention, which is probably that it's an okay removal spell, but nothing exciting, these cards are all worse. So let's look first at Savior of the Small. So this is being taken around pick 5.4, and it has a win rate of 51%. So 51% win rate is real bad. That's bordering on, it basically is unplayable. Playables have changed a lot in Limited over the years. I mean, there are cards that are in the 40s, cards that aren't intended for Limited at all, like ley lines and stuff. But they make it so there's a lot less bad cards for Limited in boosters these days. And so cards that look okay, like when you just look at their raw stats like this, a 4-mana 3/4 with pretty big upside, they're not as good as they used to be. And that's just because collectively the other cards in the set are better, right? So, and it does matter, like this isn't a card that is going to make you lose the game or something like that, but it's winning fewer games than most cards in the set are. So anyway, so what's the problem here? Well, it's sort of emblematic of a big problem in the format in general with green-white and the survival mechanic more broadly. Basically, everything that has survival has a lower win rate than you'd think. It just turns out it's hard to make creatures survive. There are swingy situations where you manage to keep your creature alive with a trick and then you get a trigger. And Savior of the Small survival trigger is pretty legit. You get to return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. So in theory, if you can trigger it once, you're getting a 2-for-1. So what's the problem? Well, A, it's harder to make a creature survive. Like, there just aren't that many board states where you play this on 4 and on your next turn, you can just attack without any support whatsoever for the Savior and have it actually survive. Like, it getting blocked by 2/2/2s isn't a good deal for you. And in a format with Manifest Dread, that's not an unlikely outcome. Furthermore, and I said this in the set review, it's a thing I didn't like about Savior of the Small, was that it has you jump through 2 hoops. So I think I gave the card a C- or a C. It's even worse than that, obviously. And the second hoop is, of course, that you have to have something in your graveyard. And first of all, making your creature survive is hard enough. Second of all, making you have a creature with mana value 3 or less in your graveyard for this survival trigger to do anything, like adding those two things together just makes this card way too hard to actually get that card back with. And in the meantime, you're playing a significantly understated creature while everyone else is dropping like much more efficient 4-drop creatures than you are. All right, let's look now at the card that's being taken the highest, and it's really the most overrated, and this kind of card always ends up on one of these lists. It's the only rare I have on this too. I tried to stick mostly to commons and uncommons, but this one is so egregious that I wanted to talk about it. It's Kona Rescue Beastie, which has a win rate of 50%, and it's being taken around pick 2.35. So again, this is a card that's a victim of survival not being very good. But this effect wouldn't be good even if survival was good. I gave this card a C in the set review. It's arguably even worse than that. And it's just like this text about getting to put a permanent from your hand onto the battlefield, it sounds exciting. But in limited, on average, you're not going to have the thing. Like, it actually is sort of like Savior of the Small. There is actually a hoop you have to jump through, and it sounds like it would be easy, but frequently by the time you play a creature like this in limited, you don't have any permanents in your hand. So even if it survives, you don't really get anything. It only gives you a discount. And so it's like, even if you do like draw a permanent on your next turn, let's say, if it's the only one you have, you could probably cast it anyway. So the fact you get to put it on the table for free doesn't really matter. So we're talking again about an understated creature with an ability that's hard to make happen to begin with, but also just is never strong. Like, these abilities, I don't know if we've ever seen one where you put a thing from your hand onto the battlefield work out in limited. Like, we just don't see it. And it's because, the general power level's too low in limited. You're not going to be able to have a grip full of cards all the time in limited, so it doesn't do anything most of the time. So yeah, being taken around pick 2.3, win rate 50%. Basically, you shouldn't be playing this card, and it's being taken like it's, in the top 10% of the set in terms of its power level. All right, let's look now at Fear of Imposters. So this one's an interesting one. It's being taken around pick 6, has a win rate of 53.7%. This card is actually better than I thought it would be. I didn't like it a whole lot. It's still not good, though. It certainly shouldn't be getting taken around pick 6. So what's the problem here? Well, unlike, counterspells that give your opponent something are never good, but stapling it to a creature is irrelevant and is a big upgrade. Like, if this card was just straight up counter target spell your opponent manifest dread, it would be horrendous like Unwanted Remake is. That style of card is just awful. But it gives you a body too, and that helps offset the fact that you give your opponent a 2/2, especially when you're countering like a removal spell. That's when it feels kind of the best, like when your opponent needs removal and you can counter it. Sure, they get to manifest dread, but them having a creature is likely, especially a 2/2 creature, is likely less relevant than letting them remove your creature or whatever. But yeah, it's still not a great card. It's like, it should be like your 23rd card, in your blue decks, especially if you have a bunch of Eerie, which lots of blue decks do, because it also triggers Eerie at instant speed. So if it was only being played in decks with like 10 cards with Eerie and other enchantment payoffs, it probably has a win rate right around, 54.8% or something like that. But it's being played too much and being taken too highly for what it is, which is like a mediocre creature with a mediocre counterspell effect attached to it, especially when you're not triggering Eerie. So, this one's not unplayable, like I kind of think Kona and Savior of the Small are. Fear of Imposters is playable, but you need to have the right deck for it, and that deck isn't most blue decks, sort of on average, because even if you are a deck with Eerie triggers, some of them are super aggressive and aren't that interested in this creature. Next, let's look at Infernal Phantom. So this has a win rate of 51.7%, and it's being taken around pick 6.25, that is. So this is one I overrated in the set review. And it's another card. I think what we're seeing with a lot of the cards in this particular video is that, we saw it with Infernal Phantom. With Savior of the Small and Kona Rescue Beasties. especially so far. When you have a significantly understated creature, it really needs to be able to do something big consistently to make up for it. And Infernal Phantom doesn't. I thought in the set review of 4 mana, 2/3, that when it dies, does 2 to something. Like, I thought that as a baseline was a fine card. I didn't think it was great. I didn't think that would be a card you always play in every red deck. But then you factor in the whole Eerie thing where this will be attacking harder sometimes. You can put equipment on it and it does more damage, etc., etc. So I thought it looked like a solid enough card for, red decks. But there's a few things here. One of them is that most red decks, every deck in this format has like 4 or 5 enchantments in it without even trying. But red decks don't trigger Eerie a ton. There aren't that many enchantments in red compared to other colors. So that's a problem. But I think the biggest problem might just be that this format has so much exile removal in it that you don't actually get the trigger that often. It's like the 2 most notable examples that are common that can just kill Infernal Phantom both for less mana than the Phantom costs and exile it are Scorching Dragonfire and the Oblivion Ring in the format, the 3 mana white enchantment that exiles something when it enters, has word 2 and all that. Those 2 cards, like, if you can shut off Infernal Phantom's death trigger, it really is just a horrible 4 mana 2/3. Similarly, like another card that can sort of shut this down for very little mana is Unable to Scream. 1 blue mana shuts off the trigger there. So the format just has, we just mentioned, a common in 3 colors that are taken pretty highly that you can expect to see against many, many, many opponents that just make Infernal Phantom's death trigger not matter. And when that death trigger doesn't matter, Infernal Phantom is really bad. And so that's a big factor, as is buffing this thing's power to 4 doesn't happen as often as you'd think. And I think this kind of card is just worse than it used to be, where it is significantly understated. So it's sort of like a bad blocker and dies to lots of cheap removal. You just can't deal with that. You can't play a card like that very often anymore. Let's look now at Dashing Bloodsucker. So this is another card with a similar problem to what we've seen so far. This is being taken around pick 7.36, has a win rate of 52.1%. So this is another one that I definitely overrated in the set review. I mean, not in a massive way. This isn't a card I loved, but I envisioned it attacking as a 4/5 with lifelink like a decent chunk of the time, and I envisioned even if you couldn't trigger it, every turn or whatever, the times when you could would do enough to make up for the times when you couldn't, because, lifelink as a keyword ability in Limited is a big deal. Like most often you're in races in Limited, and lifelink really disrupts races in a massive way. And so I sort of saw the Bloodsucker as being really capable of doing this. But kind of like with Infernal Phantom, first, black's not super into enchantments. It is more so than red, but your typical black deck isn't going to trigger Eerie a ton. Like, there are a bunch of black decks in the format that just can't trigger Eerie more than a few times a game. So that's a problem, because then we're just talking about like a big defensive creature who can get run over by combat tricks, can't really block decent sized creatures and kill them. 4 mana 2/5 just isn't very good. And that's what this is a big chunk of the time. At least, unlike Infernal Phantom, it has a large enough body that it doesn't die to as cheap of removal for the most part. But it also doesn't have like a death trigger, which can threaten your opponent to some extent, the way Infernal Phantom does. So again, understated creature without enough upside and like synergy within its color to overcome that bad stat line. All right, let's look now at both together, Orphans of the Wheat and Fear of Exposure. So this further drives home a point about green-white, that it just doesn't work. Like, in the set review, looking at the set, thinking about the synergies, these 2 uncommons looked like amazing ways to get survival going. And yeah, they can do that. But their problem is they're so all in on like a survival style deck, and that deck hasn't really panned out, that they've both ended up being really bad, despite being taken really highly. Fear of Exposure is being taken around pick 4.8, and it has a 52.9% win rate. And Orphans of the Wheat has a 53.8% win rate, and it's being taken around pick 5.55. I'll start with Fear of Exposure because I think it's like markedly worse than Orphans of the Wheat, and the data kind of bears that out. It just turns out, even in this format, it's not that easy to cast this without having to tap down some significant stuff. So either you end up casting it as like a 5-mana 5/4 trample, which is not that good, or you have to tap down some significant creatures to make it happen. In the set review, I compared it to a similar 3-mana 4/4 from the Brothers War, but the big difference with that card is it lets you tap artifacts too, and that format had a bunch of artifacts. To make Fear of Exposure similar, we also would have needed to be able to tap enchantments. Like, that would be real good. Like, if you could tap your rooms, for example, things like that, you would be able to get this out a lot easier, tapping just random enchantments, auras, whatever. That would have to have been what this does, because this format has enchantments everywhere, the same way Brothers War had artifacts everywhere. Like, you could tap meaningless artifacts to cast that 3-mana 4/4 all the time. And this just lets you tap creatures and lands. So that ends up being a huge difference, one that I didn't account for, and that people aren't accounting for in general based on where this card's being taken when they look at this card. So, it can, in fact, enable survival in the rare occasions where you're in a survival deck, but like, if you draft this format 100 times, it's probably right to be a green-white survival deck, like actually about survival, I don't know, like one time. Like, it has to be really open. You've got to get some of the rares and stuff going. It's not a deck you should end up in most of the time because it's just significantly harder to make work than other decks in the format. You can have like a green-white Eerie deck. That's a thing in the format. But for this card to matter, and for Orphans of the Wheat, which we'll get to in a minute, you have to be doing survival stuff. Otherwise, it just feels clunky as heck to play. So Orphans of the Wheat, let's move there now. I do think this one's better. It's less inefficient and less clunky. You can get it into play on 2, all the time. Unlike the Fear of Exposure, which getting into play on 3 is nigh impossible. So yeah, Orphans of the Wheat, similar thing. Like, it was supposed to set up survival where you attack and then tap a bunch of other stuff. It gets buffed, and then you get those survival triggers. Like, that sounds really sweet. But now we're back again talking about a card that has a really inefficient stat line that it's tough to overcome. This dies to every removal spell in the format. It dies to a bunch of incidental ping effects and stuff like that in the format. And the upside's not that great. Like, most of the time, if you can attack your opponent with this and then tap a bunch of your stuff, a lot of the time it's just better to attack with everything than it is to actually buff the Orphans of the Wheat. This one is like, if you're in a red-white aggro deck or whatever and you need a 2-drop, it's okay. But it doesn't do what people envisioned, especially based on where they're taking it. Like, there are a bunch of 2-drops in the format. You should take over this. Let's look now at Diversion Specialist. So this is being taken around pick 7, has a win rate of 53.4%. So, yeah, I mean, this is another card that really showcases how things have just changed and limited. Like, 4-mana 4/3 Menace would be a decent enough baseline in olden days. And maybe it's true in other formats it would be. But there is this choke point on toughness in the format, partly because of Scorching Dragonfire, where if you have 3 toughness and you cost this much mana, like, it can be a huge liability. There's just too many ways to kill it for cheap. And the upside here isn't even that good. Like, I've played with or against this a bunch, and you just don't have the time to use this activated ability nearly as often as you'd think you would. Plus, unlike a lot of versions of this effect, like, it's worse, where you have to play the card during your turn. So the turn it comes down, you don't usually get to do anything with it, unless you have 1,000,000 mana, because chances are, it's not going to be worth giving something up to exile the top card unless you'll be able to play or cast it or whatever. And then the bad stat line, as we see more and more 2-mana, 3-power creatures and stuff like that, 4-mana, 4/3s have gotten worse and worse. There's just, lots of situations where this doesn't end up trading well, even with Menace. And the upside here ends up being super underwhelming overall. All right, our last last card is Scrabbling Skullcrab. So this is being taken around pick 7. Has a win rate of 51.5%. So I do want to say, like, caveat up front here, there are times where you get multiples of these, and you can build like a legit mill deck because, you know, especially if you have doors, because they each trigger, you know, one of these 3 times. If you have multiples of them in play, things can get crazy. But overall, like, people are treating this like it's a much more legitimate build around than it is. And for that reason, it's kind of hard to actually, like, this card shouldn't be played in any deck except one with a critical mass of enchantments and multiple Scrabbling Skullcrabs. That's basically what you've got to have for it to work. And that, and people taking it pick 7 means they're taking it a lot more often. Like, it would be more fun and easier to make this card work if people were treating it how they should be, because you'd be able to wheel them if you're the one who's in on that deck, right? But where people are taking these, they're treating it like just having one is relevant, and in reality, just having one is pretty bad. Like, it's just not a good card overall. Like, there's a few things going on in the format that make it worse, but we basically never see one of these sorts of mill cards be legit, especially when you only get one of them in limited. Like, you know, I go into most limited formats assuming the mill build-arounds won't work, and that's right 9 times out of 10. And it's mostly right here. And the trigger is incredibly weak if you're just triggering it like a couple times a game or whatever. And one especially painful thing is that in this format, if you're playing, there are a lot of decks that would be happy for you to mill them, because you might get them Delirium, you might put something in the graveyard to be reanimated, etc., etc. It's a graveyard format. And then you might say, well, I can mill myself with it. And I would say to that, yeah, that's true to some extent. But even that, when it's, you know, kind of iffy to trigger and on such a bad creature, just isn't worth it most of the time. So, you know, if you end up with 3 or 4 Scrabbling Skullcrabs and like 10 enchantments, you have a legit deck. But actually making that happen is hard because people are treating this card like it's legit when it's on its own, when it really isn't. I think, you know, if we could pull up the data and look at decks that have like 3+ Scrabbling Skullcrabs and what their win rate is, it's probably pretty good. It's sort of like a collect 'em all card in that sense. But when you have one, it's probably worse than 51.5%. It's probably really, really bad, because a lot of the time playing a creature like this in a deck that isn't prepared to actually do stuff with it, it's like mulliganing. Like, you may as well have mulliganed because this is not worth a card. I think I said a minute ago that Scrabbling Skullcrab was the last card, but there actually is one more, and it is Unwilling Vessel. So I like this card, a reasonable amount going into the format. Most people seem to like it too. It's being taken around pick 4.44, has a win rate of 53.8%. I do think that's the highest win rate of any creature here, and it's certainly the most playable. But I do want to highlight this card because it's yet another one that is bad because of a bad starting stat line. You know, I was thinking if you get one counter on this, it's going to be worth it. And I think that's still true. If your deck can consistently get at least one counter on this before it dies, it's okay, or a little better even. But it turns out doing that is hard. I mean, it dies to stuff like Winter's Intervention, in addition to the more premium removal I've mentioned, like Scorching Dragonfire and the like. And the bad part is Scorching Dragonfire even negates the fact that you get a token out of this card sometimes. So you can end up doing a bunch of work to put multiple counters on this, and then your opponent uses exile removal. None of that work matters. I do think if you have a deck that has a bunch of 1-mana enchantments, like Unable to Scream, this card gets significantly better because you can wait till turn 5 to play it, immediately play an enchantment, and get that first counter. And when you do that, it's a lot better because your opponent does have to have one of those exile removal spells to feel like they come out ahead at that point. So, you know, it's sort of build-around-y. I mean, it's an okay inclusion in blue-white decks in general, but compared, like, blue-white has a bunch of high win rate, eerie payoffs, you know, and this is not in that group. It's actually probably being pulled up some by the fact that having a critical mass of enchantments in blue-white is super good to begin with. So, yeah, Unwilling Vessel, another understated creature, one that is harder to get going than you'd think, and another one that fares really, really horribly against exile removal. All right, so those are 10 cards from Duskmourn that I think are being overrated. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.